Have you ever noticed how some people simply disappear from your life without any explanation, as if you were never really important to them? There's no discussion, no closure, no clear reason you can point to, just a gradual or sometimes sudden distancing. And what bothers you most isn't just the absence, but the silent doubt that arises. Were they by your side for who you are, or for what you offered? Most people grow up believing that their relationships are based on genuine connection. They believe they are valued for their essence, their way of thinking, their unique presence. This idea is comfortable, almost necessary to maintain a sense of emotional security. However, there is a deeper layer that is rarely questioned, because when it begins to appear, it completely changes how you see the people around you. Every relationship involves some kind of exchange. This isn't necessarily negative, it's not always conscious, and often it goes unnoticed. You offer something, and in return you receive something as well. It could be attention, support, companionship, validation, a sense of belonging. This system works so naturally that it seems invisible, and it's precisely because it's invisible that it becomes dangerous. Because when you don't see the foundation of something, you start to believe that it stands on its own. Over time, you begin to occupy a specific space in people's lives. Without realizing it, you take on roles. You become the person who listens, who solves problems, who is always available, who never fails. And as long as you maintain this behavior, everything seems stable. People remain present, interactions continue to happen, and you interpret this as proof that you are valued. But there is an important difference that almost no one notices. Being valued for what you offer is not the same as being valued for who you are. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Because when the value lies in what you offer, the relationship becomes directly dependent on your ability to continue delivering on that promise. You cease to be just a person and become a function. And functions can be replaced. This doesn't happen in an obvious way. There's no moment when someone clearly says that you're only important because you're useful. On the contrary, everything continues to seem natural. Conversations flow, the closeness is maintained, and you continue to believe that it's solid. But look more closely. How many times does someone only seek you out when they need to vent? How many times is your presence more needed when you're willing to help? How many relationships depend directly on the energy you put into them? And now comes the question that most people avoid asking. What happens when you don't offer that? When you take too long to respond? When you don't resolve issues? When you're unavailable? When you simply don't have the energy to maintain the same level of service? In many cases, something changes immediately. Frequency decreases, interest cools, intensity fades. There is no confrontation, no direct complaint, but there is a clear change in behavior. And this reveals something that was hidden all along. The connection wasn't as independent as it seemed. He was, in fact, leaning on something that you were supporting. And when that something starts to fail, the structure of the relationship also begins to weaken. This is an uncomfortable point because it forces you to look at your relationships more honestly. It forces you to notice patterns that previously went unnoticed. People who only appear in certain contexts, interactions that only happen under certain conditions, presences that depend directly on what you give. And then an even more unsettling realization emerges. Perhaps it's not just about others. Perhaps at some point, you accepted this role without realizing it. Perhaps you've learned throughout your life that you needed to offer something to be valued, that you needed to be useful, present, necessary, that you needed to maintain a certain standard to ensure the continued presence of the people around you. And this creates a cycle that is difficult to break, because the more you deliver, the more you reinforce that pattern. And the more you reinforce it, the more people get used to that version of you, until there comes a point when you can no longer sustain it, whether it's due to tiredness, a change in priorities, or simply realizing that something is out of balance. And it is at this moment that reality begins to emerge, not explicitly but through subtle signs. Fewer messages, less initiative, less presence, and gradually less connection. The hardest part is that this is rarely accompanied by explanations. No one comes forward and says what's happening. No one acknowledges that the dynamic has changed. The relationship simply loses strength, as if something essential has disappeared. And perhaps it does, because if the basis of the relationship was what you offered and that no longer exists, then the connection also loses its reason to continue. This is a difficult idea to accept, because it challenges a very strong belief that people stay because of who we are. But when you look more closely, you realize that many relationships don't withstand simple changes in behavior. They aren't as independent as they seem. They are conditional, even if that has never been said aloud. And this leads to an inevitable question. If you completely stopped offering what you've always offered, how many people would still stay? It's not a comfortable question, but it's a necessary one, because her answer has the power to reveal something that has been hidden for a long time. And most people avoid finding that out, avoid change, avoid experimentation, avoid stepping outside the framework you've created, because deep down, there's a real fear that by doing this, a lot of things might simply disappear. And the question is not whether this will happen. The question is, what exactly will disappear when that happens? And that's what starts to become clear the moment you cease to be useful. At first, everything seems too authentic to question. The conversation flows effortlessly. The interest seems natural. The presence is constant. There's exchange. There's attention. There's that rare feeling that you found someone who truly connects with you. And little by little, that feeling ceases to be just a moment and begins to be interpreted as something solid. You begin to trust. And it is precisely at this point that almost no one continues to observe closely. Because when something feels real, you don't feel the need to analyze it. You just live it. You respond, you get involved, you open up. And the more natural it seems, the less you question what's really sustaining that connection. But something silent has been happening from the beginning. Expectations are starting to form. They are not declared. No one says what they expect, yet they emerge, small, almost invisible. The person begins to expect certain responses from you, certain attitudes, certain patterns, and you, without realizing it, begin to reciprocate. At first, this seems mild. Someone confides in you and you listen attentively. Someone asks for your opinion and you respond carefully. Someone needs help and you offer it. All of this happens spontaneously, without apparent effort. But here's the question that changes everything. Is this truly spontaneous, or is it the beginning of a pattern? Think of a common situation. You meet someone and the conversations start off on a positive note. There's an exchange of ideas, a mutual curiosity. Over time, this person starts contacting you more often when they have problems. You listen, offer advice and help, and this repeats itself several times. Nothing seems wrong, but something is being built. You cease to be merely someone interesting to talk to and become someone necessary for a specific type of situation. Now imagine another scenario. At work, someone notices that you solve problems easily. At first, this person asks for help occasionally. Then they start depending on you frequently. You solve problems, you make things easier, you become a point of reference. And the relationship grows. But what is its growth based on? These examples seem simple, but they show how relationships are shaped over time. Not through direct intention, but through repetition. And it is precisely this repetition that creates the illusion of depth. Because as long as you keep matching, everything seems to work perfectly. The person is still present. The interaction continues to happen. And you interpret that as proof that a genuine connection exists. But there is a difference that almost no one notices at the right time. Are you being valued, or are you simply being functional? This difference is not evident at first, because both scenarios create closeness. Both foster interaction. Both make you feel important. But it depends on who you are. The other part depends on what you deliver. Now stop for a moment and observe. How many times has someone reached out to you without needing anything specific? How many times has the conversation arisen simply from a desire to be present, without need, without any demand? And how many times did the interaction happen because you had something to offer at that moment? This analysis may be uncomfortable, but it reveals patterns that normally go unnoticed. When a relationship starts to revolve around what you give, it becomes dependent on that. And because this change is gradual, you don't realize when the basis of the connection stops being who you are and starts being what you do. Everything still looks the same, but it isn't. There is a story that repeats itself in many lives. This person was always available to a group of friends, always helped, always organized, always been there when someone needed them. They were seen as essential, always remembered, always included, until one day that person starts to get tired. Not because of rejection, but because of wear and tear. He decides to slow down, to stop taking on responsibilities that aren't hers, to stop being the center that holds everything together. And then something changes. The messages are decreasing. The invitations stop happening. The presence of others begins to disappear. And the inevitable question arises. What has changed? The person remains the same, but the role she played no longer exists. And with that, the dynamics also changed. This type of situation is not uncommon. In fact, it's more common than it seems. And this leads to a perception that is difficult to accept. Perhaps the connection was never as independent as it seemed. Perhaps she was always connected to something you supported. Now there is an even deeper point. You also begin to identify with this role. When someone constantly seeks you out for something specific, you begin to see yourself that way. You become the support, the problem solver, the one who's available. And that starts to become part of your identity within the relationship. And when something becomes part of your identity, you don't question it, you keep it, because maintaining it seems necessary. But here another important question arises. To what extent are you being yourself? And at what point are you just playing a role? This question changes everything, because it reveals that often you're not just participating in a relationship, you are supporting a structure, and sustaining it requires energy, it requires consistency, it requires repetition. Over time, this becomes automatic. You respond quickly, help before being asked, anticipate needs. And the more you do this, the more you reinforce the expectation that you will always be like this, until there comes a point when you can't take it anymore. Whether due to exhaustion, internal change, or simply realizing that there is no balance, and then you reduce it, you change, you stop. And it is at this moment that the illusion begins to unravel. Not immediately, but clearly. The answers change, interest is waning, presence weakens. And the strangest thing is that nobody explains it. No one says the dynamics have changed, but you can feel it. And when you feel it, you begin to notice something that wasn't visible before. Perhaps what seemed profound was conditional. Perhaps the connection depended more on his behavior than on his essence. And this leads to an inevitable question. If you completely stop living up to the role you've built, what's left of the relationship? This question is uncomfortable, but it is necessary, because her response reveals the difference between what seemed real and what actually is. And this difference only becomes clear when you stop supporting what kept everything running. There's a specific moment when everything starts to change, but almost no one notices when it happens. It's not a big event, it's not a declared decision, it's not a visible rupture. It's something silent, almost imperceptible. You start acting differently, perhaps unintentionally. You respond with less urgency. You stop anticipating needs. You no longer offer the same availability as before. And little by little, what seemed stable begins to show small flaws. At first, you might interpret this as something temporary, a more tiring day, a more introspective phase, a slight change in routine, nothing that should affect relationships you consider solid. After all, if the connection is genuine, it should withstand small variations, that's the logic. But practice begins to reveal a different reality. Responses take longer. Interest seems to wane. Some conversations simply cease to exist. People who were once always present start showing up less often without any direct explanation. There's no conflict, no closure. There's just a gradual reduction in presence. And then the first pattern break occurs. Why does something as simple as a change in your behavior generate such a large effect? You didn't do anything against anyone. You didn't create problems. You didn't generate friction. You simply stopped acting as you did before. Even so, the dynamic changed. This raises an inevitable question. Did the relationship depend more on what you did than on who you are? When you look more closely, you realize that this change follows a pattern. It's not random. People who depended most on your availability are the first to drift away. Relationships based on your commitment begin to lose strength quickly. Those that didn't demand as much from you remain more stable. This reveals something that was previously hidden. Every relationship has a point of support, a central axis that keeps the connection active. In some cases, this axis is real affinity, reciprocity, deep identification. But in many others, this axis is utility. It can be emotional, practical, or symbolic. And when that axis disappears, the relationship loses its balance. Now a second pattern break emerges. Were you being valued or merely needed? This difference is more important than it seems. Being needed creates dependence. Being valued creates permanence. When someone needs you, their presence depends on what you offer. When someone values you, their presence continues even when you give nothing in return. The problem is that these two situations seem the same at first. Both involve closeness, attention, and frequency. Both make you feel important, but one depends on your role, the other depends on your essence. And the moment you cease to be useful is precisely when that difference becomes apparent. At this point, something changes within you as well. It's not just the behavior of others, it's your perception. You begin to notice patterns you previously ignored. You start to see details that once seemed normal, conversations that always revolved around each other, situations where you were always the support, but rarely the focus, moments when your presence was needed, but your absence was never questioned. And then comes another disconnect. Were you in a relationship, or were you playing a role within one? This question completely changes how you interpret everything, because when you realize you were playing a role, you understand why the relationship depended so much on your behavior. You weren't just being yourself, you were fulfilling a function, and functions have a clear problem: they can be replaced. When you stop fulfilling that role, the structure of the relationship needs to reorganize itself. Some try to adapt, others simply cease to exist, and it is at this moment that the estrangement becomes most evident. The silence deepens, the absence becomes more pronounced, the frequency decreases, and the most curious thing is that nobody talks about it. Why is no one talking about it? Because most of the time, this isn't a conscious decision. People aren't rationally deciding to distance themselves from you. They're simply reacting to the change in dynamics. If what sustained the connection is no longer present, interest naturally diminishes. This doesn't mean there's negative intent. It means there's a type of bond that depends on specific conditions, and when those conditions cease to exist, the bond loses strength. Now another question arises that further deepens this analysis. How many of your relationships would survive if you completely stopped playing the role you've always played? Not partially, completely. If you stopped being the support, the available one, the problem solver, the understanding one. If you simply existed, without delivering anything beyond your presence, how many people would remain the same? This is a difficult question to face because the answer is rarely comfortable. And this leads to another pattern break. What if the separation isn't exactly a loss? What if it's a filtering process? The moment you cease to be useful is not just a breaking point, it's a point of revelation. It shows what the real basis of each relationship was. Some remain, others disappear, and those that disappear leave a specific feeling. It's not just sadness, it's a mixture of surprise and understanding, as if something finally made sense. You begin to realize that many connections worked because you were supporting a larger part of them than you imagined, and this leads to an inevitable conclusion. Perhaps the problem isn't the fact that people are leaving. Perhaps the problem is the time it took you to realize what was really keeping them around. And that perception changes everything, because from that moment on, you stop trying to recover relationships that were based on conditions, and you start to question which ones really make sense to keep. But that's not the most profound point yet. There's something even more unsettling behind all of this. Something that doesn't just involve others, it involves you. There's something deeply unsettling about the way people disappear. It's not a dramatic process. It doesn't involve intense arguments or formal farewells. It's silent, gradual, almost imperceptible at first, and perhaps that's exactly what makes it so hard to accept. Because when there's conflict, there's also a reason. But when someone simply vanishes, what remains is an absence without a clear explanation. Think of someone who has been present in your life for a long time. Frequent conversations, constant exchanges, a feeling of closeness that seems solid. You get used to that presence. It becomes part of your mental routine. And then, without warning, something begins to change. At first, they are small signs, a response that takes longer than usual, an interest that seems a little less, an invitation that doesn't happen. None of this in isolation seems relevant. You even try to rationalize. Maybe the person is busy. Maybe they're going through a difficult time. Maybe it's just a phase. But what happens when these signs cease to be the exception and become the norm? It is at this point that the absence begins to become evident, and along with it comes an uncomfortable feeling. It's not just longing, it's confusion. Because you try to understand what changed, but you can't find a clear event that explains the separation. And then an inevitable question arises. How can someone who seemed so present disappear as if they had never really been there? Studies in the field of social behavior reveal something that few people consider. According to analyses published by the American Psychological Association, a large part of relationships outside the intimate circle depends directly on context and function. This means that many connections exist because there is a specific environment that sustains them. Now think about how many relationships in your life began within that context. School, work, academia, social networks, joint projects. In all these environments, you are not just yourself. You occupy a role. You participate in a dynamic, and this dynamic creates closeness. But what happens when this context changes or loses strength? There's a very common story that illustrates this clearly. Two people work together for years. They share the same space, face the same challenges, and talk every day. They create what seems to be a strong friendship. Then one of them changes jobs. Initially, contact continues. Messages are still exchanged. There's an effort to maintain the connection. But over time, the frequency decreases. Routine ceases to connect the two people, and gradually, contact disappears. What happened to that relationship? Did it cease to exist, or did it simply lose the environment that kept it alive? This distinction is essential because it reveals something that many people avoid accepting. Not every connection is built to survive outside the context in which it originated, and that doesn't mean she was fake. It means she was conditioned. Now, an even more uncomfortable point arises. Not all disappearances happen because of a change of environment. In many cases, everything seems to remain the same. You're still in the same place with the same people in the same routine, and yet someone drifts away. Why does this happen? Here's where a factor that is rarely analyzed in depth comes in: the perceived balance within the relationship. Research on social dynamics indicates that relationships tend to last when there is a sense of balance between what each person offers and what they receive. This balance doesn't need to be mathematical, but it needs to exist. When this perception changes, behavior changes along with it. Now think of something straightforward. If you start offering less of what you've always offered, what happens to that balance? He changes. And when he changes, some people stop seeing value in continuing the relationship. This doesn't usually happen consciously. No one sits down to rationally decide whether to walk away. The change happens automatically, guided by self-interest, necessity, or convenience. And that's why disappearances are usually silent. There is no final conversation. There is no clear closure. There is only a gradual loss of interest. And this leads to a perception that is difficult to ignore. Perhaps that person wasn't connected to you, but to what you represented to them. And when that representation ceases to exist, its presence also ceases to make sense. Now observe your own life. How many people have gone through this before? How many relationships seemed important at one point, but no longer exist today? This is not an exception. It's the norm. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed that there is a cognitive limit to the number of stable social relationships we can maintain. This concept, known as Dunbar's number, suggests that our brain naturally selects which connections will be maintained and which will be discarded over time. But this limitation doesn't explain everything. The truth is that many relationships don't disappear simply because of a lack of ability to maintain contact. They disappear because they cease to serve a purpose within the dynamics of life. And that completely changes how you interpret those losses. Because in this scenario, the disappearance is not an accident, it's a consequence. And perhaps the most difficult point is accepting that this doesn't necessarily involve malice. In most cases, people aren't trying to harm you. They're simply responding to what makes sense to them at that moment. And this may sound cold, but it's real. Now comes the question that few face honestly. How many of the relationships you consider important today would still exist if you completely stopped fulfilling the role you play in them? Not partially, completely. If you stopped being the support, the available one, the problem solver, the understanding one. If you simply existed, offering nothing beyond your presence, how many people would still be there in the same way? This question is uncomfortable because it reveals a truth that many people avoid seeing. Not every absence is a loss. Some absences are revelations. They accurately show what the real basis of each connection was. And perhaps the most unexpected aspect of all this is the following. People who disappear aren't necessarily at fault. They only cease to exist when the condition that sustained their presence no longer exists. And when you understand that, something changes inside you. Because the focus is no longer on who left, and that's what really made those people stay. There comes a point where simply observing behavior is no longer enough. You notice patterns, understand changes, identify departures, but something essential is still missing: understanding the internal mechanism that sustains it all. It's not just about what people do, but about how they perceive you. And it is precisely here that Carl Jung's perspective reveals something that completely changes the way we interpret relationships. According to Jung, a large part of human connections doesn't happen between two real people, but between psychological images that each person constructs about the other. These images are formed by expectations, desires, needs, and past experiences. In other words, when someone approaches you, that person is not only seeing who you are, but also what they need to see. This creates a silent distortion. You believe you are being recognized for your essence, but in practice, you are often being recognized for what you represent to others, and this representation may not have a direct relationship with who you really are. Now think clearly. If someone projects onto you the image of someone trustworthy, that person will connect as long as you maintain that image. If they project someone who solves problems, the connection depends on your ability to continue solving them. If they project someone who offers validation, the relationship is maintained as long as you provide that validation. But what happens when you no longer fit that image? The projection is starting to fail. And when the projection fails, the connection loses its support. This is a point that many people misinterpret. They believe they were rejected as individuals, when in fact what was rejected was the breaking of an expectation. And that completely changes how we interpret the situation, because the estrangement ceases to be something personal and becomes something structural. Now there is an even more important detail. You are also part of this process. Jung described the concept of persona as the social mask that each individual constructs to adapt to their environment. This mask is not necessarily false, but rather an adjusted version of oneself, shaped to generate acceptance. Over time, this persona becomes automatic. You realize that certain behaviors generate positive responses. Being available creates closeness. Being helpful generates recognition. Being understanding generates trust. And without realizing it, you begin to repeat these patterns. Gradually, this ceases to be a choice and becomes a standard operating procedure. You're not just being yourself, you are being the version of yourself that functions socially. Now a direct question arises. If you stop acting this way, what happens to your relationships? This question is essential because it reveals how much your presence is linked to the performance of a role. When you stop putting on that mask, something inevitable happens. The expectations that people have created about you are no longer being met. And when that happens, the projection breaks down. And when the projection breaks down, the connection that depended on it also weakens. This explains why many people distance themselves precisely when you begin to change. It's not a coincidence. It's a direct consequence of the misalignment between what they expected and what you began to offer. But there is an even deeper point. Often you are also connected to the image you created of the other person. In other words, the relationship was not based on the reality of either side, but on mutual expectations. And as long as those expectations were met, everything worked. But when one of them ceases to be supported, the entire structure begins to fail. Now observe the impact of this. You begin to realize that some relationships demanded that you maintain a constant standard. They demanded that you always be available, always present, always consistent, and any deviation from that standard generated instability. That's not a connection. This is behavioral addiction, and behavioral dependence does not sustain deep relationships. She only maintains functional relations. Now another question arises that changes everything. How many people in your life know you beyond your job title? How many people remain present when you offer nothing but your presence? How many relationships survive when you stop living up to what others have always expected of you? These questions are not simple, but they are necessary. Because when you start answering honestly, you realize that many connections weren't based on who you are, but on what you represented. And this leads to a change of perspective. You stop seeing the separation as an unfair loss and start to see it as a natural adjustment of dynamics. People stay where there is alignment between expectation and reality. When this alignment disappears, the relationship loses its meaning within their internal logic. And this doesn't necessarily involve negative intent. It involves consistency with how each person perceives value. Now, there is a point that most people avoid facing. If many of your relationships depended on your persona, it means that at some point, you also chose to maintain that version of yourself, perhaps out of a need for acceptance, perhaps out of fear of rejection, perhaps out of habit. But that choice had consequences. He created connections that depended on the continuity of this pattern. And when you start to break out of that pattern, those connections naturally reorganize themselves. Some cease to exist, others become superficial, and a few remain. These few are different. They do not depend on their usefulness, they don't depend on your performance, they do not depend on your ability to meet specific expectations. They exist because there is genuine recognition that is not linked to what you do but to who you are. This type of connection is rare because it demands something that few relationships have. It requires both people to be able to see beyond the projections, besides the masks, in addition to the functions. And that's not common. Most relationships don't reach that level. Most remain within structures based on exchange, need, and convenience, and that defines their limit. Now comes the final question of this stage. If you know that many connections have been built upon projections, What do you do with that information? Do you still maintain pretense in order to keep relationships going? Or do you begin to accept that some connections only existed because you were performing a function? This choice defines the next step, because from the moment you understand this, it's no longer possible to go back to the previous state, and this leads to an inevitable point. A point at which everything that remains takes on a completely different meaning. There comes a point when you realize you can no longer go back to being who you were before, not because something external forced you, but because seeing things changes you irreversibly. After you understand what sustained many of your relationships, after you realize how your usefulness influenced people's continued presence, you can no longer pretend that none of that exists. And this realization doesn't come lightly. It comes with a mixture of clarity and discomfort. Clarity because everything starts to make sense. Discomfort because you understand that in many moments it was you who maintained dynamics that were not sustainable. Not out of weakness, but out of a need for belonging, out of habit, out of fear of losing connections that seemed important. Now, for the first time, you can see more clearly. You can identify who came closer when you were available. You can notice who disappeared when you slowed down. You can recognize patterns that previously seemed like coincidences, but now show a clear logic. And that logic is simple. Many people weren't connected to you. They were connected to what you represented to them. Accepting this is not easy, because it breaks a very strong expectation. The expectation that relationships are based on who you are, but at the same time, this break opens up space for something more genuine. You begin to realize that not all permanence has real value. Some permanences are sustained by self-interest, convenience, or momentary need, and when that changes, the presence changes too. This doesn't mean all relationships are superficial. It means you need to learn to differentiate, and this is exactly where the most important part of all comes in. What do you do with that awareness? Because understanding without action changes nothing. If you continue repeating the same behavior, offering the same level of automated delivery, assuming the same roles, nothing will actually change. You will continue to attract the same type of dynamics. So the first move needs to be internal. You need to reduce the need to be needed. This doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means stopping acting on autopilot. Before offering help, consider whether it was truly requested. Before making yourself available, ask yourself if it makes sense for you at that moment. Before taking on a role, understand if it's a balanced one. This adjustment completely changes how people interact with you, because now their presence is no longer guaranteed. And when something ceases to be guaranteed, it becomes clearer. The second step is to accept the discomfort that comes with change. When you stop supporting certain dynamics, some people will distance themselves. This isn't theory, it's practice. And distancing can breed doubt. It can make you question whether you're making the right choice. But this discomfort is not a mistake. It's a sign that something is being filtered. If a relationship depends solely on its usefulness, it will not withstand change. And that is not a loss, it is a revelation. The third step is learning to observe without reacting immediately. When someone withdraws, the natural tendency is to try to understand, try to recover, try to adjust. But now you need to do things differently. Observe their behavior. See who reduces contact, who maintains it, who only shows up at specific times. This observation, made calmly, reveals more than any verbal explanation, because behavior reveals priorities. The fourth move is to reconstruct your way of positioning yourself. You no longer need to constantly prove your worth. You no longer need to anticipate everything. You no longer need to guarantee that you are always available. When you establish clear boundaries, you change the type of relationship you build, and this has a direct effect. People who are there solely for the job tend to drift away. People who are able to connect with you beyond that tend to stay. The fifth step is to adjust your expectations about relationships. Most people believe they should have many deep connections, but the reality is different. Truly solid relationships are few and far between, and that's not a problem. It's a natural characteristic. When you accept this, you stop trying to turn every connection into something meaningful and start valuing what truly demonstrates consistency over time. Less quantity, more truth. And then there's the final move, which is the most important. You need to accept that not everyone will stay, and that doesn't diminish its value. Actually, it does the opposite. Because when someone stays even without depending on your usefulness, that presence has real weight. That connection doesn't require constant effort. It doesn't need artificial maintenance. It simply exists. And that's rare, much rarer than it seems. Now think honestly, how many people stay in your life even when you offer nothing but your presence? How many relationships remain stable when you're not being helpful? These are the connections that matter. The rest is part of a natural transitional process, and understanding this completely changes the way you experience your relationships. You stop chasing after those who drift away. You stop trying to hold on to what can't be sustained. You stop investing energy where there is no real reciprocity, and he begins to build something more solid, something that doesn't depend on function, but it's about recognition. Now, if all of this made sense to you, if this content brought you clarity or even a necessary sense of discomfort, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring this type of reflection. Like the video so that more people can access this content. And if you want, share your experience in the comments. You can do this anonymously, because in reality, more people go through this than you might imagine. The difference is that few have the courage to see and act.